In the post-Civil War economy and society, we saw the age of inventions. Inventions such as the telegraph, the telephone, the transcontinental railroad, steam-powered drilling for oil, oil refineries, refrigerators, sewing machines, electricity, the light bulb, um, direct currents, alternating currents. These all changed the daily life and the business life in America. They connected us through communication. They made the standard of living much higher. They changed our daily routines. They changed the market and the economy of the nation. Behind closed doors, this also allowed for various investment opportunities to be made. And through combining capital, receiving investments, and receiving loans from banks, different men, who are referred to in one of two ways in this chapter, were able to expand their businesses to very large levels. Your main focus of this lesson is that big businesses created wealth for their owners and for the nation, but also prompted controversy and concern over the methods that were used. Traditionally, the men that we're going to talk about in this section, including John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, were referred to sometimes as robber barons. This derogatory term basically labeled business leaders as men who built their fortunes by stealing from the public. They drained the country of its natural resources and persuaded public officials to interpret laws in their favor. They supposedly ruthlessly drove their competitors to ruin and paid their workers meager wages and forced them to toil under dangerous and unhealthful conditions. On the other side of the spectrum, these men are also viewed as captains of industry. As captains of industry, these business leaders serve their nation in a positive way by increasing the supply of goods by building factories. This raised productivity, and this mass production expanded the markets, enabled the distribution of more goods across the country, which also was more efficiently done and produced at a cheaper cost, so that the retail price was not as high. This also created many jobs that enabled Americans to buy the new goods that were on the market and then raise their standard of living. These men were also philanthropists, creating museums, libraries, and universities, many of which still serve the public today. John D. Rockefeller specifically, who was the owner of Standard Oil Company, although he had questionable tactics, which we will be going over, he donated approximately $500 million to charities and institutions. He established the University of Chicago, as well as the Rockefeller Foundation, which focused on public health, arts, and social research. Andrew Carnegie, the steel tycoon. He lived according to the gospel of wealth, which basically said that people should be free to make as much money as they could, but after they make it, they should give it away. He donated over 80% of his earnings to education, established 3,000 public libraries worldwide, and also donated approximately $350 million to charities. Now, the reason why these men were able to succeed is because of a theory called social Darwinism. Now, according to Charles Darwin, all animal life had evolved by natural selection. The fittest survive to reproduce. They're at the top of the food chain. Social Darwinism takes that same perspective but looks at our social mobility between the social classes of lower, middle, and upper. It basically held that society and government should not interfere with each other, that government should stay out of business, so that people can naturally evolve, so to speak, to their proper position in society. If the government would stay out of business affairs, basically society as a whole would benefit because the men who were the fittest would succeed eventually because of their own specific talents and their abilities, and this would weed out the men who were unfit in society, who would not be as successful. And most Americans believe this. They believe that the government should not interfere with private businesses because we do not live in a command economy. We live in a market economy. So as a result, the government neither taxed profits nor regulated their relations with workers. Inadvertently, though, some of the business tactics that these robber barons, so to speak, came up with and implemented inadvertently took away the competition that our market economy so very much relies on, extending us more towards a command economy than they had intended to. Now, business on a large scale, and you guys probably know this already, is run quite differently compared to businesses on small scales. When you have business on a large scale, with numerous factories all over the country, mass production, lots of laborers, number one, you have to have large pools of capital. This inability to get massive amounts of money from either investors or from the banks really limited the smaller businesses in the country and helped the larger businesses. There was a wider geographic span because of the railroads and the telegraph. This helped with this larger geographic expansion of businesses. And this also caused the development of factories and sales offices to be in different regions, hence regional offices. There was a broader range of operations. Big businesses often combined multiple operations and were responsible for all of the stages of production. This made sure that the men who worked in those areas and managed those areas were highly specialized and could combine these operations, and it basically created a more efficient system. The role of ownership was completely revised. Instead of the owners being in the factories and managing their employees, now they had professional managers who run the businesses. And then there are new methods of management in general. There's more complex systems of accounting. They had formal and written rules for the daily routines, and they had specialized departments. So instead of one person, one man having to be specialized in all the areas, you can set up a bureaucracy, so to speak, where you're specialized in different departments, so that everyone's an expert in their area. Now, these men who built America, which is a very valuable series to watch if you ever have time. I believe it's on YouTube from the History Channel. With these new market structures, these men were constantly trying to gain a competitive edge. And it's said that they weren't as concerned with making a profit as much as they were with winning. So different types of innovations, so to speak, in business ownership start popping up with these men. One of those is an oligopoly. Basically, today, some oligopolies would be breakfast cereals, car companies, appliances. It's when a certain industry is dominated by only a few large, profitable firms. Some companies also made it their goal in the late 1800s to gain monopoly power. If you know anything about the board game, it means that you basically own every space, or almost every space, so that no matter what, when your opponents land on a space, they end up paying you money. You have monopoly power over the board. This is when you gain complete control of a product or service, whether you buy out your competitors or you drive out your competitors out of business. This is dangerous, though, and this eliminates competition between businesses. And competition is what, number one, makes sure that products improve consistently, because different business owners are trying to improve their products, so it's always better than the other guys. And it also takes away the lower prices, because if you have monopoly power over something, you can charge the public whatever price you want. Some industrialists prospered by taking steps to limit competition with other firms. One way of to do this, besides monopolies and oligopolies, was to form a cartel, which was a loose association of businesses that make the same product. This limits supply of that product to keep the prices very high, supply and demand. They also utilized the economics of scale. It was specifically done by Andrew Carnegie, which stated that as production increased, the cost of each item produced was lower. And this kind of goes with the cartels as well. Since this was the case, and it was very much true, more production, the goods were cheaper, they would limit how much was being produced through an agreement with each other so that they could keep the prices high for the consumer. Another type of system to maximize profits and make the most efficient type of production was called horizontal consolidation. Basically, with horizontal consolidation, which was utilized mostly by John D. Rockefeller with his Standard Oil Company, you bring together many firms in the same business. Now, it's not exactly buying them out, but the purpose is to eventually buy out competitors. State laws prohibited this. This was basically a trust, which was not allowed because state law did not want one company owning the stock of another because they were afraid it would limit competition. Because eventually that large business or that consolidation of owners at the very top who are buying out their competitors would end up having monopoly power or an oligopoly, which limits competition, if not eliminating it. So in order to kind of skirt around the legalities, Rockefeller's lawyer Samuel Dodd in 1882 came up with the idea of having a board of trustees so that all of the owners in these top oil companies that were going to join together to try to buy out the independent oil refineries, they became allies in the Standard Oil and combined all of their assets into this board of 9 trustees. So now you have a board of 9 trustees. Technically, they are not a trust. They are not a group of businesses working together to put the independent oil refineries out of business. Instead, they are a board of trustees. Basically, then they were promised a share of the profits as these new independent oil refineries were purchased and bought up. The board was controlled by Rockefeller. Eventually, this is addressed by the Sherman Antitrust Act, which we will go over in a minute. But this is one of his practices that was a little questionable because it wasn't technically illegal, but it wasn't technically legal. A more accepted form of consolidation was done by Carnegie, which is called vertical consolidation. With vertical consolidation, Carnegie gained control of the many different businesses that made up all the phases of his production. This created very low production costs, which enabled him to sell his steel at very cheap prices. Everything from the mines to the ships to the railroads, every process of his production was owned by him. He owned all phases of production, which means if he needed something transported on the rail line, he didn't have to pay anybody. It was his rail line. If he needed to get the raw materials so that he could extract his oil or steel, through the Bessemer process, it was his mine, it was his workers. Now the government responded quickly to John D. Rockefeller, specifically through the Sherman Antitrust Act. And I say quickly, but that doesn't mean effectively. They were hesitant to get involved with businesses because Americans did not want the government overstepping its boundaries. American businesses like the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, General Electric, which was actually created by J.P. Morgan, who we will be talking about in class. These were America's success stories, and they were sources of wealth, including loans to the government if need be. So, in 1890, in response to the trust that was formed by Rockefeller, the government passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which outlawed combinations of companies that restrained interstate trade or commerce. It was not very effective. For 15 years, the general and vague wording was strictly interpreted by the courts, and it was no secret that the courts were very pro-big business. It actually, ironically, ended up hurting the labor unions because the labor unions were identified as a trust or grouping of laborers that was infringing upon businesses, which was limiting their production, which was limiting their sales, which was limiting their competition. So the Sherman Antitrust Act, which we learned about in ninth grade, actually ended up being used against the labor unions during the Great Strikes. Now here's a primary source on the Sherman Antitrust Act, just so you can see what it attempted to do. Every contract combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy, in restraint of trade or commerce among the several states, or with foreign nations, is declared to be illegal. Every person who shall make any contract or engage in any combination or conspiracy hereby declared to be illegal shall be deemed guilty of a felony, and on conviction thereof shall be punished by fine not exceeding $10 million, if a corporation, or if any other person, $350,000, or by imprisonment not exceeding 3 years. That is an excerpt from the Sherman Antitrust Act. So it tried to restrict monopolies through the threat of imprisonment and fines, but it was largely ineffective because the courts could very much interpret this law how they needed it to be in order to protect the big businesses. Now, in class, we're going to be talking about J.P. Morgan, we're going to be talking about social mobility, and we're going to be analyzing whether or not these men were more robber barons or if they were captains of industry, to get your perspective on it. So be prepared to utilize the information that was in this presentation. And also think about the shifts in population and employment by taking a look at this graph. You can see that the rural population drastically changed in the decades from 1860 to 1900. You can see how the rural population slowly is going down, but you have to remember there's still westward expansion, so it's not going down as drastically. But there is a sharper increase in urban development as people are moving to these big cities for their jobs, as we're getting more immigrants, as the newly freed slaves are coming up from the south to cities like New York and Pittsburgh and Chicago to find work. You can also see the shifts in the U.S. labor force. The red is professional workers, trade, finance, education. We were talking about those specialized departments because of the expansion of industry and factories and businesses. You need men specialized in different departments, almost like a business bureaucracy. That didn't even exist prior to the Civil War. You could also see the industrial worker, mining, construction, manufacturing. That is increasing. And then the agricultural worker is slowly declining because people are realizing that they can purchase their goods in stores now. They can purchase their food in stores. They don't have to farm. They could go to the city, get a job in a factory, get a paycheck, and buy it off the shelves. So we are seeing right here in these two graphs a shift from one previous type of lifestyle and economy to the one that we know better today.